Thanks very much. So I'm going to, let me just give some brief introductions here. At the far end, we have Frank Marshall, who is the producer of the Armstrong Lie. You certainly know Frank's career as a producer for Steven Spielberg and so many other great films. Closer to my documentary heart, Frank directed an ESPN documentary in the 30 for 30 series called Right to Play a couple years ago. Next to Frank is Bill Strickland, author of the book Tour de Lance and editor-at-large for Bicycling Magazine. Next to Bill is Jonathan Vaughters, former cycling teammate of Lance Armstrong. Next to Jonathan is Betsy Andreu, the wife of Frankie Andreu, a cycling teammate and of Lance Armstrong. Betsy Andreu, many of you know, especially if you've seen Alex's film, was an early and outspoken critic of Lance Armstrong. And then to my left is Alex Gibney, the director of the film, who has been to TIFF with so many other films, including Client 9, Mia Maxima Culpa, Last Gladiators, etc. So I want to start with a question to Frank Marshall. Frank, as I understand it, this film had its origins because you were exploring a fiction project about Lance Armstrong. Can you talk about how that moved into a documentary?
Sure, that's correct, Tom. I was on the United States Olympic Committee, the USOC, for all of the 90s and into 2000s, and I sort of became the go-to Hollywood guy if you had a story about an Olympian. And also on the committee with me was Bill Stapleton, an Olympic swimmer who happens to also be Lance's agent and lawyer at the time. And he came to me because Lance had written this book, It's Not About the Bike. And I read the book, and I certainly thought it could be a movie. And I did know that there was an executive over at Sony, Matt Tolmach, who was also a co-producer of the film with Alex and I. Matt and I bought the book together for Sony. He was an executive at Sony at the time, and we developed a narrative film. I got a couple of scripts, and as often happens, these things get done and don't go forward. So cut to after Lance retired in 2005, it kind of fell by the wayside. We had a couple of people interested, but we could never get it off the ground. And then when Matt and I, Lance actually called both Matt and I and said, I'm thinking about this comeback, and we said, well, we'd like to shoot it. If you do this comeback, we'd love to shoot it. We'd love to make a documentary about it. Maybe that's what we can get going here at Sony, and we did. And kind of the rest is history. We found Alex, who also didn't know anything about cycling at the time, which we thought was good because we wanted a view of the sport and at that time the comeback that would reach a broader audience and tell them about cycling and how great cycling was, and so to look at it from that perspective.
So Alex, let's get into that. You approached this project in 2009, which is really, it's a comeback story. What did you come away, after you filmed the 2009 race, what did you come away with, and why is it that you shot it in 2009 and we're not seeing the film till 2013?
Well, this is a story really of two films, and the first one, we shot all of 2009, followed Lance all around. We shot every stage of the 2009 Tour de France, and in that film, you know, which had been called The Road Back, that was a comeback title, but it was also meant to suggest that the comeback was also a way of leading back, because even from the start, you know, I was certainly aware of allegations of doping. So, but nevertheless, the focus of that film was the 2009 comeback, to just follow Lance along that road and see what we saw. As we were just finishing that film in 2010, the scandal began to erupt, you know, first with Floyd Landis, then Tyler Hamilton, the federal investigation, so forth and so on. It seemed that even as Lance's story was becoming unbelievable, so the film that we had made and was virtually completed was no longer relevant. And so what happened was, I went back in, we just put it aside for a couple of years, and then late last year, we got, we found a way forward to put it together. And I went back in and started to look back at what we had shot and realized that a lot of what we had shot was actually, we had captured things very different than what I had, the meaning was quite different than what I thought it was when I was shooting it. So it was a kind of reinvestigation of what I had actually done and a role I had played. In a way, I felt like I had been used to some extent as a kind of, as part of a con. And so I went back to look at my own role and to look at the footage that I had shot and hadn't fully appreciated at the time, and then began to shoot a bunch of new interviews with Betsy, with Jonathan Waters, with Bill Strickland, and others, and indeed even Lance. We went back and did that. So it became a way of looking back at the old film, try to re-understand it, my own role. I put myself in the middle of the film, and then came out with something completely different. And now for something completely different.
Excuse me, Tom, I was going to say one of the important things when we first talked to Alex is he said, I'm not just going to go to certain things. I want unprecedented access. I want all access to the house, to the bus, to the training, to everything. And that was the deal that we made, and certainly turned out later when Alex was going back to look at the footage, we realized we had all the stuff that we didn't know was so important then, but was now important to this movie.
And frankly, I think one of the interesting things about the 2009 comeback was that Lance's team and his group, in all their arrogance, figured that there was nothing to be discovered. And so they gave me access to certain people who almost not talked to anybody, like the famous Dr. Michele Ferrari, who had become known as Lance's doping doctor. So it ended up being a rather extraordinary opportunity to see something that was hiding in plain sight, but was actually there. We could find it. And even as what we were also capturing was a very sophisticated kind of promo operation.
Bill, let me ask you, because you wrote the book, Tour de Lance. When you watched this movie last night, and I should say for those of you in the audience, Bill, Jonathan, and Betsy saw the film for the first time yesterday with the audience of 1,200 people at the Ryerson. You know this story well. What does Alex do in this film that is new for this story?
Thanks. I thought the way that Alex was able to look at 2009 as sort of a microcosm of everything that a deception and a lie is about, and it really, we all know the story. He was a bike racer, he had cancer, he came back, he won, he doped. So it seems like it's all known, but there's such a fresh perspective to it, and it really makes you start to wonder why it is that every time some people get to the crossroads where they can do the right thing or the wrong thing, when it gets really hard, they do the wrong thing. And so I think it's just a very interesting way, and so a way that no one else has done so far, to look at a story that we all know.
Betsy, you were an early vocal critic of Lance Armstrong. Alex had said to me that when he first reached out to your husband Frankie, that you had an adverse reaction to. Can you talk about that?
Well, it's always been Lance's modus operandi to cozy up to people of influence and of power, and so I remember after he won the first tour, the second tour, that there were mumblings that, oh, there's a Hollywood producer here, and that there was going to be a movie about him. And so I was very skeptical. I didn't trust Alex at all. When Alex came back to me afterward, after the recent decision, I said, I don't want to be part of it if it's going to be Frank's film, because I don't trust it. And I credit to Alex, because when I first talked to him, he is a very good listener, and I really think he is a man of integrity. And so I thought, like I said last night, there's two people who have immense power, Travis Tigert and Alex Gibney. And so I know Travis was on the side of wanting to get the truth out. And so I trusted my guts and I told Alex that I would cooperate with him. So we developed a relationship through the years, and I'm just grateful that Alex was a man of integrity and that he did want to get the truth out, and it was going to be a no holds barred.
I want to go to some questions from the audience in just a minute, but first let me bring Jonathan into this conversation. Jonathan, as a former teammate, what's your takeaway watching this film?
You know, I think it was an accurate and realistic, and I mean that in the strongest way you could say that, real look at what cycling is on the inside, on the outside, and you know, it showed the sport for the incredible, beautiful sport that it is, and it also showed the weaknesses and the flaws of the sport, and that's, I mean, that was my takeaway.
I'm ready to take some questions. Bruce Kirkland from the Toronto Sun.
Yes, excuse me, as Tom said, Bruce Kirkland, Toronto Sun, Sun Media. And this is a question that I would direct to any of you, but start with Frank and Alex. And that's, as consumers of information, we think we know a lot about this whole incident already. So playing the devil's advocate, why make a film now at this point to add to the noise around it? In other words, what can you accomplish through this film so that we can be more enlightened about this story and why it's relevant to society?
It's a good question. You know, though, I guess, you know, my partially flip response would be, you know, if you're going to make a film about the Titanic, you know the Titanic hit an iceberg and you know that it sunk. Those are the facts of the matter. But the devil is always in the details. And I think in this film, the devil is in the details. And you see a number of things. I think you see a portrait of an elaborate lie, in part because it was so grand and so big, and you see the mechanism of it. You see the anatomy of a lie. And I think, particularly with film, you know, when somebody is lying to you, and Bill in the film talks about the enormous power that Lance had to look you straight in the eye and said, I've never doped. Not only that, how could you say that I, as a cancer survivor, would ever take performance-enhancing drugs? There's a certain power there. So looking at the faces, looking at the way people talk, looking at the way that all of this was reckoned with, it has a power that's, you know, that is the power of film that I think is very important. And it goes in after the noise to be able to look in the quieter moments for what we might have missed. I think also there is a power to the sport, and also, you know, in putting myself in the film, I had to reckon with the whole position of the fan's need for a dream, the fan's need for a kind of a perfect story. And Lance was the most perfect story of all. And in a way, the complicity of the fan and myself, and then the media and others in cultivating this story and protecting this story, even though, you know, if we were looking for doping, it wasn't like a few people knew about this. A lot of people knew about it. And there was a lot of, you know, Betsy and others had brought forward a lot of facts. So it wasn't about the facts. It was really about there was a kind of aura about this story that I thought was important to tell. Even as I was telling this sports story, which you can't separate the two. You can't say, oh, it's about doping. It's really not about doping. It's about something much more intangible, about what we look toward in the whole sporting endeavor.
He said it all. It was fascinating for me too, as a filmmaker, to start one movie and literally get it finished. I thought it was ironic that Matt Damon was talked about to be the star of It's Not About the Bike way back in the early 2000s, and then he narrated our old film, and then we put it on the shelf. But we had all this footage and we had all this access, and we really, you know, when the truth finally came out, we just thought we have to get that old footage because we have stuff nobody has, and we have to tell the truth. And that's what documentaries are all about.
This may be the only time in history that I will ever replace Matt Damon as a performer.
And if I can say, my reaction is a little bit different. I'm thinking, are you kidding me? Because the truth is important. There are those of us who spoke the truth from the very beginning. And it's not because I had something against Lance, but it's because the truth mattered. I firmly believe that's how he got his cancer. I think it sends a terrible message to children. We see that kids in high school, their parents are buying them performance-enhancing drugs. Shame on all of them. This is a lesson to be learned. It is a teachable moment. You have the USA Cycling Federation, a big shame on them. You have the sponsors, you have the doctors, you have the fans, and you have the majority of the people in the media which were complicit. They didn't care. I want to point out Stephanie Genzer from The National in 2005. She's sitting right back there, who was one of the only people from the beginning to contact us because she did believe us, and she didn't believe the lie, and she knew it was important. It's because the truth matters, and we have to learn from it.
Take another question. Yes, sir.
Hello, Sanjeev Kular from I Love Film. I guess the question on many people's mind is, what took so long for the truth to come out?
I'm going.
That's.
I think that's a really good question. In a way, that's the mystery at the heart of the film. Because if you go back, you understand that, from the very first moment in 1999, there were questions about whether or not Lance doped in that episode. So it started at the beginning. But I think what's interesting is there was a kind of general agreement that this story was so big, so important, so many people wanted to believe in this story. Jonathan talks a little bit about that in the film, that there was a kind of willful denial of anything that would interfere with that story, and Lance was very effective at using the enormous appetite for this story to great effect.
That's one of the, and this even addresses your question a little bit, that is one of the things that I think that this film addresses that has not been addressed in any newspaper articles and Nightline, so on and so forth, and all the publicity that happened when Lance was finally brought out, is that this film addresses the fact that without the need for so many people to believe in this superhero, without the complicity of the governing bodies that oversaw the sport, that sort of it was one set of rules for everybody, but for this icon, who was curing cancer for this guy, there was sort of another set of rules. And that's what this film puts to light much better than anything that I've seen written or talked about at any other point in time. One thing Alex and I talked about, and this is years ago, but Lance, it's not that I mean, you could say he's good or he's bad, and it's a whole debatable point, but he knew that the public wanted him as a hero. And I can remember one time where I said something, just a little trash talk during a race, nothing all that bad, just back and forth in an interview. And he put out just a little thing on Twitter that just said, this guy's a jerk. I don't even remember what it says, but it was just a little blurb. And all of a sudden I was getting phone calls from, sponsors, from race organizers, from fans, all basically saying, you're a bad person. Like, how dare you question him? And, that's something that, I had to deal with privately, and it is what it is. But that's why it took so long to come out, is because you had this enormous need for this to be true.
And if I could add, a lot of the stuff in the USADA report really wasn't new. It was already out there. A lot of it was reported, but a lot of people just did not want to listen to it. And it was like banging my head against the wall saying, oh, when is there going to be this collective acknowledgement that here we are telling the truth? And it's here.
I asked Lance actually why he reached out to me a few weeks before Oprah and called me and apologized, and also said he wanted to find a way to make it right and to tell the truth. And I said, well, at what point, did you decide to take this road instead of to continue to fight as you always had? And he said, well, you know, you'd always defended your story so assiduously. He said, well, the story was no longer believable. So I found that to be a really interesting comment, because it was the belief in that story that, you know, enabled it to hide in plain sight, or enabled the lie to hide in plain sight.
Take another question up front here.
Hey, my name's Matthew Ritchie, and I'm with Screen International. And my question's for the whole panel. I was just wondering, thinking about Lance, like, he's obviously not the first professional athlete to lie, cheat, or dope, but he certainly kind of proves himself to be the most unpopular. And I was wondering why you think that is, when, you know, athletes like Alex Rodriguez most recently comes out and is really hated by the public, but it seems like people are a lot more offended by what Lance did.
I think there's two reasons, two big reasons. One is Lance didn't simply say, you know, I have never tested positive. Going back to what I said earlier, he said, how can you say that I, as a cancer survivor, would ever take performance-enhancing drugs? That was a way of taking the nobility of what he was doing in terms of trying to fight cancer and making millions of cancer survivors all over the world complicit in that lie. So their very hope that they looked to him for was tarnished. And so for a long time, even despite all evidence to the contrary, cancer survivors believed in Lance and believed he was telling them the truth despite all evidence to the contrary. And finally, it was revealed to them that actually he was lying. So that was a terrible betrayal, I think. I think the other thing was that this is not really a story about doping. It's a story about power. And Lance abused his power. He had enormous power as a celebrity. And in order to attack people who were telling the truth, like Betsy, you know, he went after them and went after them hard. And I think, you know, when people see in retrospect that somebody abuses their power to go after people who are trying to tell the truth, well, I think they're deeply offended by it.
Yeah, that's, I mean, just from the perspective of, you know, a witness in this whole thing, you know, I was a former professional rider. I was on U.S. Postal Service. I also doped. And for a long time there, you know, I was scared to speak about it because I knew that it was, you know, that the legend was larger than I was, and I was just, you know, some guy who used to race a bike. But what changed that, what made me eventually step forward, was a feeling of injustice, not about the doping, but about the abuse of power. I watched people who I was in contact with, like Betsy, like her husband Frankie, like Floyd Landis. I watched these people just get absolutely railroaded to the point where they were basically unemployable, you know, in public, because their images had been just scattered and crushed. And you know, it just came to a point where I couldn't sit back anymore and watch them get torn apart. And I mean, I remember you and I, we used to, Betsy and I, in a couple others, it was like we had these little like secret support groups of just like, okay, well, you know, I'm probably going to get fired tomorrow, or, oh, you know, it looks like, you know, something, because I actually did this interview, or we actually spoke about this publicly, and we were just waiting to get, you know, crushed. And that's it. I mean, we can all name hundreds of professional athletes that have doped at one point or another, but when it gets to the point that it's really, really hurting people, then, you know, it's gone too far.
And from the fans' perspective, when Lance came back, it wasn't I'm coming back to a bike race. It was hope rides again. And so people were invested in an enormous emotional and even spiritual way with this guy. And to have that sort of turned around on people, I think that's what makes what he did particularly odious. You know, it wasn't about a game or a sport or even a yellow jersey. People were really invested in a big way in matters of life and death. And there were people who were, you know, fighting cancer, who had believed in this guy, who the next day had to find out that, well, no, actually it was all a fraud. It wasn't real. So I think that's what makes it really distasteful to the world at large. You know, there are very personal reactions to it, but I think what the movie really does well is shows the spread of how popular he was and how he became bigger than the sport. And you know, the higher you fly, the harder you're going to fall when you finally go.
Hi, Chris Michael from The Guardian. I'm wondering, I guess maybe it's a question for Jonathan, but how big do you think Bradley Wiggins' victory is for the sport?
That's a little out of left field. Bradley Wiggins, particularly, not Chris Froome. Oh yeah. No, I mean, listen. I think that you know, I think the sport as a whole has made a lot of progress. It's my hope and belief, but then we're back to that word belief again. You know, that we've seen much fairer competition in cycling. I think Brad, you know, from everything I know about him, is a, you know, he's a great guy that I think he grew up in a time where doping was starting to be seen as contemptible as opposed to acceptable. And you know, kudos for cycling to have the ability to kind of dig in and deal with. I mean, again, it's not cycling as a whole. It's guys like Alex, people like Betsy, especially, who made the decision to take the hard steps to actually open up an environment where, you know, the Tour de France is a changed game, and you know, it's our hope that going forward that the sport is able to learn from these lessons and you know, become credible and live up to the beautiful potential that it has.
It's been interesting that for a while now cycling has been seen as the dirtiest sport. What I think it is, it's the first sport to really clean up. And so what I would say to fans, true fans of other sports, you know, I would just say, like, hang on, because you're getting ready to go for a ride in the next few years, because we're gonna get to all of them eventually. This is not particular to cycling, although cyclists are very, very good at it.
Let's go to the back.
Hey guys, Blake Dillon from Chill Media. I was just wondering, you keep referring to it as almost two separate movies. As filmmakers, were you discouraged or violated or anything, or were you excited at the opportunity to kind of continue the story?
It was more like, once the story had started, I wanted to see it through all the way to the end. And it took a radical twist and turn, because the story that had become, that was so widely believed, was now unbelievable. And I had to look at my own role in that, you know, and examine that back to the beginning and retrace my steps. So it wasn't so much, I think I never questioned the idea that I would keep on going. We put the film aside. We didn't abandon it. It was just, it was the idea that the story had changed, and the job was to follow it, but now to follow it in a very different way, and also to examine what we had done in the beginning. So that may have been the most interesting part, was to retrace my own steps, even as I looked at the story in a completely new light.
Were you excited to do that, though? Or was it discouraging a little bit to have to kind of go back and start over?
It was starting over, and yet at the same time, I felt it was like on a journey, because we didn't throw out everything that we had. You know, as Bill talked about earlier, we still ended up using the experience of 2009 as a lens to look at this larger story. So everything that we had seen hadn't been lost. It was a way of just kind of taking a moment and looking back at what we had and and exploring it in a different way with new eyes. So was I excited? Or was I disappointed? I felt it was a challenge that I was really up for, and actually the story became far more intriguing. And frankly, maybe I got back on more familiar territory, because I had certainly, you know, if you look at a film like Enron or something like that, I mean, this story ironically has certain parallels to a film like Enron. And I kind of got back to that story at the end of the day.
Yeah, I wouldn't say we were excited, but we were kind of thrilled by the challenge. And it was a fascinating turn in this movie that had been one thing, and then we had to go out again and convince people to talk to us. I mean, Betsy wouldn't talk to us at first, and you know, Alex explained what the movie, because we were perceived as the puff piece, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't even let them film us at the 2000.
Yeah,
He actually specifically forbade them.
You notice I didn't obey you. I filmed you anyway. But,
but for example, Travis Tigert, who runs USADA, would not talk to us still. So it was a real challenge, but a challenge that we loved. And we're happy to.
It was funny to go from inside the cordon, because actually if you look at the images of the film, you'll see that, you know, Lance's team bus, unlike all the other team buses, was surrounded by a kind of a fence, a cordon, to keep people out who were 9, 10 deep, you know, and we were always on the inside. And there was a lot of resentment from the people on the outside to those of us who were on the inside. And it was interesting being in the bubble. But it was a powerful notion, and I kept trying to go from inside the bubble to outside the bubble, and I found that a lot of people outside the bubble didn't trust me because I had been inside. But over time, you know, we got to see the full perspective from both inside and outside the bubble, and that made it a much more interesting film.
As a follow-up question to Alex and Frank, you started off in this journey, you know, making a film that was more celebratory of Lance and an insider with Lance, and in the film, you know, we see a kind of personal closeness that you have, a camaraderie that you have with Lance. Can you talk about, you know, personally going from that interaction to, you know, to one of being so critical of him? It's a movie called The Armstrong Lie. That's a tough position.
I had to reach out to Lance and tell him that the film was going to be called The Armstrong Lie. So, you know, I had to confront that, and I had a relationship with Lance, but the nature of the relationship changed. It inevitably became more honest and more forthright, but it's still a difficult thing when you have a relationship with somebody like that, and you know that the position is going to be more adversarial, and yet you're asking them to continue to talk. Actually, I said he owed it to me. You have to at once be a good listener, but also be forceful about expressing, you know, where you're at, so that you don't feel like you're trying to deceive somebody by pretending you're their pal and your friend. You're going to always reflect their point of view, but to assure them that you will listen to what they have to say. I think that was big. I know that, you know, over the course of time, Bill Strickland was also in this position, where Lance would reach out to him from time to time and talk to him about what he might do or might not. It's a tricky position to be in, but I found that it was important to reckon with it honestly. It was odd. I mean, it was a relationship in which you had to establish certain limits, and yet at the same time recognize that there was a relationship there.
We have time for one or two more questions.
From I Love Film. I believe you mentioned that this movie is more about just the biking industry and sport. How do you see this as a reflection on society in general? I mean, have the lessons really been learned? In history, there's a quote that says, the truth is not important, victory is.
The truth is not important, victory is? Yeah. Well, it turns out in this story, truth is important. And the victory turned out to be a loss because a lie was told, and the truth will out sometimes. And I think one of the larger lessons here, you know, this is, you know, as I reflected on earlier, that lessons are tough because, you know, history does repeat itself, and it seems like we don't learn the right lessons. I mean, I made the film Enron in 2005. It seemed like we would have learned our lessons about financial fraud and the need for stiffer regulation. But then we had the 2008 global financial crisis. Nevertheless, you know, there are lessons that do stick. And I think, you know, this is a story that goes way beyond cycling, to probe into those areas of how to be skeptical, you know, if something's too good to be true, how to trust your gut on stuff like that, and how important it is to try to tell the truth, because at the end of the day, it does make a difference. So, you know, I think there are a lot of important lessons that go beyond cycling in this film.
And if I can chime in, there's quite a few lessons to be learned here. And on a personal level, if you want to see if you can trust somebody, see how they conduct themselves with the people in their personal lives, because if that says a lot about the person who they are. I don't think money and power corrupt somebody. I just think it brings out the person that's really there. And it doesn't matter from my perspective if it seems like I was just at one time one woman against an empire. I was just a stay-at-home mom, and you know, I shouldn't say just because
it's a big job.
It's so, but it was at times it was consuming, and it seemed like it was my job. And just a few months ago for Career Day, my son, who's in 8th grade, said, "Why don't you go in as a, you know, working for USADA?" And I said, "Because I don't work for USADA," and so, but that's what the perception was. So Frankie's story and my story, it's a story of redemption. Frankie did something wrong. He never got on Lance's doping program, and when he said no, he paid the price for it, but he ended up doing the right thing, even though it cost him, and it's standing up to the bully. And even though one man with courage makes a majority, and if you stick to your guns, and if you're resilient and stubborn and tenacious, and with a lot of prayer, hopefully it'll come out your way. So the truth matters. The truth matters, and stand up to the bully. It'll eventually, hopefully, get better.
What, there's no other questions there. I want to kind of wrap up with one final question. What are the questions still to be asked about this story that any of you on the panel would still like to ask someone or get out there?
I mean, the big one that Alex was able to touch on, but I don't think has been fully addressed, is, you know, the systemic problem of the governance of cycling. And it's, you know, Lance was literally allowed to have a set of rules that was unique to him. And that, you know, did he abuse that? Sure, he abused that. But in a way, you know, the adult, the parent in this situation should have been the people running the sport. And what they chose to do was to basically take the best financial path as opposed to the most ethical path. And it repeated itself over and over again, all the way up until the last minute, where, you know, they were still fighting the U.S. Anti-Doping Association about who had jurisdiction over this case, trying to, you know, which they'd never done before. It was one set of rules for this person because he was such an icon. It was another set of rules for somebody else. And to me, that is, because what happened to Lance, there's a lesson to be learned, but if we want a lasting change as a result of all this, that's what has to change. And the way governance, and this goes into governance of, you know, politics everywhere, of governance of your town, of your country, of those issues have to be explained. We have to stop incentivizing cheating. And that's something I think that's everyone's responsibility, and certainly the people that are governing people, that it's their responsibility.
Yeah, I think, you know, in many ways, this is a film about the ethic of win at all costs. And, you know, I think that's in sports, and sometimes we admire it in sports, sometimes we admire it in business. And yet then when we face the ugly truth about the downside of that, we're surprised or appalled. But it's part of the same package. So, you know, that, I think, writ large is you know, remains a question, which is how will we continue to look at this whole ethic of win at all costs? Is that something we admire, or can we really imagine a world in which winning is not always the most important thing?
We also have the 2009, the 2010. Lance says he intended to be clean. What does that mean? I think we will see that he was also lying there. I think Lance wants to redeem himself. Everybody should be given a second chance, but how many second chances? What has he done? Why is he still hanging on to his medal from the IOC? Why?
They asked for it back.
They asked for it back. He still hasn't given it back. Yeah. What has he wouldn't even meet with me just to look at me eye to eye, just as a show of humanity. So you can say something, but then follow it up with action. So there's still, it's not over, and I think Alex's film is just, it's very, very good, and opens up a lot more questions that people are going to be asking.
Thank you all for coming, and thanks especially to the team from the Armstrong Lüge.
Thanks.
Thank you all.